What steps should the United States be taking in assisting Ukraine's reconstruction, even now while the war grinds on? What are some of the key foreign investment needs, and how can private investment in Ukraine be incentivized? What opportunities exist for collaboration between the US and Ukrainian businesses? I'm Dr. Kathleen McInnes. I'm the director of the Smart Women, Smart Power program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm also senior fellow here. And I am honored to be moderating this incredibly distinguished panel to get into some of those questions that are so critical to thinking about Ukraine's present and future. I have with me Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, who's a senior fellow at Harvard University Belfer Center. I've got Greg Page, who's a retired chairman and CEO of Cargill. I've got Oksa Jarkuta, who is the International Strategic Initiatives Director for the Bank of America. We've got Maria Longi, who is the coordinator for the Office of the Coordinator of U.S. Assistance to Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia for the U.S. Department of State, and Sofian Youssoufi, who is the U.S. Future of Ukraine leader at Deloitte. Again, an incredibly rich panel, so thank you so much for joining us today. And if we could just get to business, Paula, Ukraine's security is inextricably linked to reconstruction and economic modernization. What are your views on the security and strategic situation of Ukraine today?
Well, first, thank you, Kathy, and also I want to thank CSIS for bringing us together yet again. I see Dan Rundy over there now. Wave to Dan Rundy. Dan Rundy and CSIS brought us together, I believe it was 2 years ago, with the formation of a commission, and I'll be answering your question. Yep. The commission was formed, and what I like about it is it wasn't just a one-stop. We met, we discussed, and then we moved on. I think all of you know that there was a discussion, business conference last year, and a number of issues were tackled. We're meeting again this year. But I raise it because that commission 2 years ago, in its report that it released, it had two things that are very relevant to your question. It said, we have to win the war in Ukraine, but we also have to win the peace. And then it went on to articulate that in order to win the peace, there has to be an investment in economic reconstruction. You can't just only have the investment that we are making, not just the United States, but with our allies and partners, not only in Europe, but also in the Indo-Pacific, in helping Ukraine win this war. And it's a struggle, as we know, but it has to be simultaneously also winning the peace, which is economic reconstruction. A few other points. In that report, it also mentioned the important role of the private sector, that it's not just only about the multilateral institutions that have a role to play, but also the private sector. Why? Because the private sector is innovative, the private sector has flexibility, and also the private sector is in a capacity to really dive in deep and to really work on the ground in some of the key areas. What were the areas identified as being crucial? By the way, I will say this from I remember both the World Bank and the IMF, they said Ukraine and Ukrainians have mentioned over and over the investment in infrastructure, and in particular housing. Housing was number one. Why housing? Even over energy. Energy is important, but housing, because you know that there are a substantial number of Ukrainians who are outside of Ukraine. There's a very strong desire in bringing that human capital back. How can you have reconstruction if you don't have the cherished human capital and innovation from within Ukraine? So I wanted to highlight that. And as part of that, and I've noticed the topics that have been discussed here already, one key topic is, and a crucial one, that I think still remains out there and is something that has to be tackled. Private companies talk about insurance. I remember from the very first discussion, they will say, all right, we're willing to move forward, we're willing to invest, but we want insurance. So that is one of the stumbling blocks here. And I would say, just in conclusion, Ukraine has also, Ukraine's officials and also its private sector has really spoken very eloquently about the priorities, and they're very clear. Modernization is a goal and really a focus, and also Ukraine sees it as a great opportunity and turning point for Ukraine. If one could even say that there's any kind of silver lining, and forgive me maybe for using that word in this war, that it might be an opportunity for Ukraine to actually achieve this modernization and also a greater and stronger integration with the European community and the West, and pulling away from the kind of entanglement eastward.
That's a wonderful segue to the next question I have for Oksa. Could you please provide us with your sense, your overview of the investment landscape in Ukraine?
Yeah. Well, I think the investment landscape in Ukraine, I want to start by just the statistics, right? Which I think we all know, but they kind of require repetition. It's a population of 38 million that probably will go back to 45 million. That's the 42nd largest country in the world. It's the 11th country by arable land, right, in the world. So again, if you think about what the territory of Ukraine is, which makes it 45th country in the world, 55% of it is arable land. The current GDP is about 180 billion. That makes it 58th country in the world. But if you just think GDP per capita in Ukraine at the moment is about $6,500, $7,000. You just compare it to Poland next door, similar population, $23,000, right? So if you just think about the possibility, the opportunity, the business opportunity that exists in Ukraine, it's pretty straightforward. The investment climate at the moment, of course, is very, very challenging, right? And I think we need to be realistic about what is doable in the current conditions. And as you mentioned, insurance is a big part of it, and insurance in a broader sense, not just actually writing a policy for war risk insurance. But at the end of the day, I think we're trying to get businesses in the States in particular to really think about what is my Ukraine strategy for as and when this war is over, right? And I do believe that every business that actually sells internationally should be thinking that. Just the way that we were thinking back when the Soviet Union broke down and this huge market opened up in Eastern Europe, it's the same situation now. Again, it's a 40 million population country. It's a huge market. It's a very sophisticated market. And this is before we even start talking about the resources that are actually available in the country, right? Agriculture is pretty obvious, and Greg will be a much better person to be talking about it. But it's, it has 7% of titanium reserves in the world, right? If we think about where our energy transition is going, the metals that we need, 7% are in Ukraine. It has the largest lithium deposits in Europe, right? Again, when we think about electric cars and what we're going to be producing and how we actually want it to be sourced locally in that particular region, that's an opportunity, right? And these are just some of the examples of what is actually in Ukraine. So I think from an investment perspective, while we are going to be realistic that at the moment it is going to continue being quite challenging, every business should be thinking, what's my Ukraine strategy for when this war is over?
So turning to Sofyan, what are the key industries in Ukraine that present significant investment opportunities for U.S. businesses? And in your view, why should they be considering investing now?
So first, thank you to CSIS and this team and everybody who's here, because obviously if you look at the room, I see a lot of partners and allies who are going to turn the tide in Ukraine. So I'll start with the market first, then go into industries, and then get to some of the specifics. So if you look at the market in Ukraine, so RDNA 3 report came out earlier this year. The range is somewhere between $460 billion to $1.3 trillion in terms of reconstruction. Now think about that magnitude for a second. There's nothing comparable that we know in the world today, nothing. So since the Second World War, this would be the single largest reconstruction opportunity. The second point is, this is not about rebuilding Ukraine. This is about a new Ukraine. This is about a modern economy. This is about the future of Ukraine, hence we have created this practice called the Future of Ukraine. Because when we sat down with our clients, the CSOs and others, we felt that in the US, early days, they didn't really have a Ukraine strategy. Actually, that wasn't even on the map for them because of various reasons. One, if you don't have proximity to the market, if you have no experience in that market, if you don't know what is a set of rules and regulations, how do you enter the market? Who are the customers? What are you going to sell? What is the proximity to other nations and other? So it's very difficult. So then you asked about the industry. I think it's probably an easier list for me to give you if you were to ask me what industries are not going to be applicable in Ukraine, but I can start off with the top and the obvious ones. So housing, we've talked about housing. Housing is going to be a major component of reconstruction. We have, and I have a whole list, so we've done time and time again, we refresh this for our clients and go and meet with them on the regular on when to start, where to start, and how to start.
Right.
The when to start is, and see, I disagree with many of the other established companies that they want to wait for the war to end and then enter the market. I think it'll be too late for them then. Their market comes in waves. So generally the ones who enter the market first generally reap the most benefit out of it because they've established connections, they know the talent pool, they've studied the market, they've tested out certain things, they've done pilots. Then the rest of the folks follow, and then the last entrants are the ones who are generally they miss the market. Obviously agriculture is another big component of that. Transportation is another significant one. We feel that about 15% of opportunities in the total are going to come from transportation. Energy is another 10% of it. So again, and none of these markets by itself is a non-significant market. So tremendous opportunity. I also feel that when we go into any of the new markets, so we work with a number of clients in commercial industry as well as developing nations, there are certain hypotheses that people come up with about a certain market. So for example, in Ukraine, if you look at the ingredients that you need in any new country, any market, the first and foremost for me is the talent capital. Mm-hmm. So if you look at, so when I was in Kyiv, I kid you not, the talent pool there is remarkable. It's second to none. Mm-hmm. The resilience, the ingenuity, their ability to create net new solutions. We've seen them do this over and over and over again. Now, if a group of people can accomplish so much during war, imagine what they can do after that is done. So obviously I'm really bullish in this market, and again, happy to talk to a bunch of you. But I also feel that outside of core circles here, Washington DC and beyond, the level of familiarity and understanding of Ukrainian market is scarce. It's not that great. Now there are some other challenges too. We'll come to that towards the end, but I did want to sort of outline that first.
Thank you for that overview and for those thoughts. Turning to Greg, especially with the comments from Aksa about the end of the Cold War and investment and those transition periods, why did Cargill invest in Ukraine in the 1990s? And Cargill's still there today despite the war, as are some other companies. Could you also talk about the state of Ukraine's agricultural sector?
Yeah, so Cargill went to the Ukraine. We started our biggest facility in January of 1998 in Donetsk. We built a world-scale sunflower seed processing plant. You can argue our timing wasn't that great given the financial chaos that followed. Working with President Kushma, we stayed and completed the plant and were rewarded for that fact. It became one of the great success stories for Cargill and enormously successful business until the Russians destroyed it in 2014. So why did we come to the Ukraine? 4 big key points. First and foremost, the soil. Some of you will nod when I say Chernozem, but some of the very best soil in the world, accompanied by most years adequate rainfall to optimize that soil. So rainfall and soil. The second is the farming regions in Ukraine are close to tidewater, which makes it a natural as an exporting location. So if you want to use the word of proximity as a negative for some industries, but for agriculture, the proximity of Ukraine to Egypt, to North Africa, and to the Middle East, who are structurally food deficit countries, is an outstanding and enormous benefit. And so you got the right soil, you have the right rainfall, you have proximity to the markets that need those products. And so all of the ag firms, not just Cargill, that came to the Ukraine in the late 90s into the early 2000s were rewarded for coming. And the industry grew from very small exportable surpluses to, before the war, over 100 million tons of production, and almost 60 million tons of that made its way to Tidewater and out of the country. So why will the global ag companies, why have we all stayed, and why are we likely to reinvigorate our growth at the end of hostilities? It's because all the reasons that we came are still true, probably even more so, as the world wants to grow more sustainable aviation fuels using agricultural products. The demand for the soil and rainfall of the Ukraine and the structural deficits of fast-growing populations that are very close to the Ukraine is more urgent than it was before. I think the other point to make is not only can we feed the world more economically from the Ukraine, we can also feed it more ecologically responsibly from the Ukraine, given the topography and the proximity. I think the last point I would make that keeps it important to everybody in the world is, I'll use the word, we have increasingly fickle weather that we try to produce the world's food in. And in that increasingly fickle weather, we need more countries of origin that we can supply the world's food safety net. And regaining the status that Ukraine should rightfully have is not just in the interests of Ukraine, but in the interests of all of our food security if we're going to continue to have disruptive weather. So last week, I made a number of calls. It was a good chance to refresh after a time away from the market, but calling people I knew in the marketplace. So I'll give a quick crop report, not so much, but I came away amazed by the optimism, the ingenuity that's been mentioned on the panel, and by, frankly, the courage. One of the best examples, one of the food processing companies clearly harmed by the disruptions in the electrical grid. Instead of standing there complaining, they are building a biodigester on the factory campus. They will use agricultural waste to anaerobically generate methane. They'll use the methane to generate electricity. How can you not want to invest in a place that in the midst of war builds a biodigester to increase their energy reliability to continue to produce and process ag crops? So I found the purchase of new farm machinery, investments in agricultural technology are much higher level than I would have expected given the circumstances. I found the availability of crop inputs, seed, fertilizer, chemicals, spare parts, in most cases sufficient for the number of acres that are being farmed now, which is about 20% less than pre-war, but impressive in that it's sustained at that level, and we had anticipated it will sustain next year at a similar level. So they have the machinery, they have the crop inputs, the rail lines. In a couple of the months in 2024, since January, the rails delivered to the ports quantities of grain pretty close to pre-war levels, which I think if you only read the American press, you would find surprising given the reports of targeting of the rail system. So obviously the repairs and the ingenuity to keep those rail avenues running is impressive. And the fourth one, most important, and for some of the people in the audience, is the availability of operating capital is what makes farming take place. The access to loans to buy inputs at planting time and to finance through to harvest is critical. And it is in better shape than I would have expected in the Ukraine. The interest rates for the best farmers who have clearly the best credit ratings are not that much higher than for farmers in the US Midwest. As you get down in the skill and size range, the cost of the credit and the availability of it is more constrained. And so that's an opportunity we can all continue to work on for small and mid-sized agriculture. So net, the foundation's still there, folks. It just, the cessation of hostility, private capital in the ag and food space will flow back to the Ukraine and not into a disastrous environment when you consider that This year, they're probably going to produce in the high 80 millions of tons of grains and oilseeds. So the concerns, one is about labor availability. A number of the people I spoke with talked, particularly with the mobilization that's coming up, that will they lose some of the skill sets they need to run these increasingly mechanized farms. And the final one, and it's affecting agriculture everywhere, is the low prices are starting to have their impact. That being said, no sense whatsoever that Ukrainian farmers will plant fewer acres next year. Last thing I'll say, I asked everybody at the end of the call, what is something the world can do now to help Ukrainian agriculture? Shout out your answer. Open the Red Sea, which should have been obvious to me given 42 years at Cargill. And that proximity advantage that they enjoyed to the Middle East has now gone away, and when they have to serve some of their customers, they have to go all the way across the Mediterranean and around the Cape. And that added freight comes out of the pockets of farmers. And at a time of very low prices, the impediment of not having access to the Red Sea harms the consumers that buy more expensive food and certainly harms Ukrainian farmers.
Well, Marie, if you could bring us home, and what are the priorities for U.S. foreign assistance in supporting Ukraine's reconstruction and recovery? And how is our assistance working to advance private sector engagement and investment in Ukraine?
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, everyone. I think it's pretty clear that the U.S. commitment to Ukraine, especially since Russia's unprovoked invasion in February of 22, has been strong and continuous. Our assistance, I'll just give you some numbers to kind of lay the groundwork. We've contributed over $91 billion in assistance since that date. And that includes military assistance to help Ukraine win the war, but also non-military assistance. We've provided about $2.8 billion in humanitarian aid, over $57 billion in military and civilian security assistance, which includes police and border security, $26.8 billion in budget support, and over $4.6 billion in other economic and development assistance. To kind of round out those numbers. I think all of this contributes to Ukraine's ultimate recovery and reconstruction. So the military assistance, which Ambassador Dobryansky indicated as well, it's all part and parcel of a successful reconstruction and recovery. We're also very proud that our leadership has helped to motivate 50 plus other countries to contribute to Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. And the numbers that we see from other donors is almost $150 billion. So much more than the US alone, but together it's a significant contribution to the war effort and the recovery effort. The way we look at this, we've had 5 supplemental appropriations from Congress that contributed to these dollars over time, and so planning is incremental, and it's adjusted all the time based on what's happening on the ground and what's happening in the world. But we are always balancing the short-term needs. Some of those being, as you've seen recently in the electricity sector, as the war is hitting that sector hard, we adjust our assistance accordingly, as well as looking to longer-term efforts as how we spend our money. I think if you look at recovery, reconstruction, as far as the framing of this panel, I'd put our assistance in 2 categories. One, which is very important and foundational, has to do with governance and reform. We put a significant amount of our funding into anti-corruption institutions, the court system, local governance, because those are all very foundational to a successful recovery. And then the other part of assistance, I would say, is what you would think of as kind of standard recovery and reconstruction. So railroads, border crossings, as well as enabling growth in key sectors such as agriculture, energy, and the IT sector. Some examples of our programs, USAID has an agriculture program, Agro, that has helped farmers with storage and grain and equipment to get their product to the ports. They've also had co-investment programs that have made financing available to over 700 micro, small, and medium enterprises to allow them to work in those sectors as well. And since March, since even before the war, they've helped with Ukraine's development of their DIA platform, which is a governance and IT platform that has ultimately, they helped create the Ukrainian DIA, what's it called? DIA City, which has special legal parameters that allow the IT industry to thrive in development. Give me 1 second here. I did want to also mention that we have, I think there's a general recognition in the international community and in Ukraine that donor assistance on its own is not going to reach the resource limits that you mentioned, the $500 billion to $1 trillion+ dollars. We have worked on several different levels to kind of not just assistance to the private sector, but working with the international community. The multi-donor coordination platform, which was created about 1.5 years ago, now named the Ukraine Donor Platform, is we helped stand up a business council in June, and that business council is starting to work with the business community across Europe, including U.S. businesses, to contribute in a formal way through this platform to talk about priorities for Ukraine's reconstruction. And so that is a way that we have helped elevate the private sector and insert it into some of the structures that are being created with the international community. Last year, the keynote speaker at this conference was Secretary Penny Pritzker, who spent a year as the special representative for Ukraine's recovery. She just finished her term, and Deputy Secretary Verma has taken over the work. But through her work, she elevated the voice of the private sector. She pushed on reforms and anti-corruption efforts at a very high level, because truly those foundational issues are what's going to be important for Ukraine's ultimate recovery and reconstruction. So that engagement at those levels, in addition to our assistance, I think have been a way that the U.S. government, through our assistance and through our diplomatic engagement, have helped raise the voice of the private sector in Ukraine's recovery.
Well, thank you to all of you for such an incredibly rich discussion so far. I wanted to invite our audience, if you have questions that you would like to ask the panel, you were passed out index cards. There should be some on your seat, or you should have some in your packet. Feel free to write your question on the card and raise it up, and somebody will collect it and pass it up to me, and I'll read it out. If you don't have an index card and you would like to ask a question, raise your hand now and one will be passed over to you. But while we wait for questions from the audience, I'm going to turn over to Paula, who wanted to jump in.
I did. I wanted to jump in because I wanted to comment on your remarks, Greg, and then also something that Maria said. When, Greg, you were describing what's gone on in the agricultural sector, you breathed life into, I think, what I was trying to say at the beginning. In this sense, think about it. Ukraine is a major breadbasket. It also exports massive amounts of grain. So, by the way, an argument that always comes up is, well, you know, Reconstruction, what can we do, and how do you sustain that with the public? The fact of the matter is, if that grain doesn't get out, it's not just only about what happens to Ukraine, but there are so many other countries. It's a global issue, and that's the answer here. For those that argue, well, what's the relevance here? And what's the incentive? And you reminded, because you mentioned the Red Sea, and I was thinking, I believe it's 75% of Egypt's grain reserves come in from Ukraine. I believe they import about 75%. I saw that figure. China, by the way, also brings in a certain percentage. I believe it's in the range roughly of some 40%. But the fact of the matter is, what he's saying, it has great relevance for Ukraine's own internal well-being and welfare, but it has such ramifications for others. And that's one of the key elements and points as to why this issue matters. It's not some isolated issue for reconstruction for Ukraine. And I wanted to say that because as you were giving the data, I was thinking, well, of course, this is a global issue, and you just stated it. And I wanted to say something about a point that Maria made at the beginning. I don't know how many of you look at Transparency International has an index, and they report on, you know, the corruption data and status. Ukraine has moved up the ladder during the war, and that's not something that's well known, and it should be known. Is it perfect yet? No. But I think it's very commendable that the fact that while the war is going on, they have worked very hard actually to deal with that issue, which affects investment and incentive, and people want confidence. So I wanted to underscore that. Thank you.
Well, no, thank you, Paula, and just highlighting that, you know, across these different comments for me, that there are risks to not being the first mover in these markets, right? And there are critical opportunities that can be lost if we are not there. So I'd love to turn to Sophia to pick your brain a little bit more. What conditions do you think would need to be met, or what would we like to see for U.S. businesses to build their confidence to invest in Ukraine? What kinds of things can be done?
So, so we've been talking to a number of businesses, those who are operating in Ukraine, American businesses, as well as other European businesses, and those who might be interested in operating. And there's sort of like 6 areas that have come up. Some of them are fairly commonly discussed, so I'm not going to take too much of your time to go over them, but I will just quickly highlight them. And some of them are not so openly discussed. Obviously, there's been a need for, there's been a discussion point around bankable projects. Over and over again, that industry needs bankable projects that they can assess, that they can evaluate, that they can, map relative to their strategy and then invest in. At the URC in Berlin this year, the Ukrainian government did issue a listing of 95 projects totaling about $25 or $26 billion. And, I think it was interesting that on the one hand, industry had asked for that information, but on the other hand, when it was provided, I think the level of engagement sort of varied by industry, given the time horizon. But I do think that there's a there. So what we have been doing is, sort of taking that information to a set of our clients, discussing it with them, and opening up some doors to engage in Ukraine. They're really sizable projects, right? So for example, in energy sector alone, there are 15 projects totaling $9.5 billion. And again, I can go over, but so that's the first, having bankable projects. I also think within that category, the project prioritization and preparation facility and the mechanism is also important, because in Ukraine, there are various priorities for various sectors and for various donors. And I think sort of kind of establishing a framework around that. There are a couple, but I think there could be some improvement there. The second, I would say, barrier to entry is the legal framework. And if you were to ask an American company interested in doing business in Ukraine, there are a number of really significant barriers that they need to overcome in order to operate in Ukraine successfully. Experience is one of them, but also understanding, navigating the reporting requirements, compliance requirements, all of that. I think the availability of blended finance is a third, is a third bucket, which is important. We've talked about war insurance over and over, so I'm not gonna belabor that point, but I think having other financial tools that can mitigate that risk is going to be significant. We've also talked about risk mitigation strategies. There is
there is significant risk right now in operating in that market. This is a war zone. I mean, it also creates certain complexities. Actually, there was a panel earlier today, and I had the privilege of having, sharing a meal with the Ukrainian mayors yesterday. And one of the things somebody mentioned was, look, the risk profile of cities is different. It's not like all of them, like we put Ukraine in this big red bucket.
Right.
There are certain cities which are located in a certain location, which, they have certain industry, they have certain talent pool, which is different than some of them which might be, have a higher level of risk. So I think we need to kind of create some sort of a grid. And the last one is, the public sector and private, sector kind of coordination. I really am really impressed by the work that USAID has done on this front, and state. I mean, the way they have come together, pulled companies together, the amount of requests we get to meet with them and companies and others to engage in this economy is phenomenal. So I think we need to replicate that at a broader scale to reach full potential. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, Aksa, if I could bring you in on a separate but related question, what resources are there available for a company that's interested in investing in Ukraine?
Yeah. So I think, again, it's setting up and going through sort of what's needed through the process. First of all, there is a tremendous amount of support from various U.S. government bodies, and there's a lot of experience, right? So USAID is clearly one, but there's a number of programs that are being set up just in terms of giving that comfort and giving that entry for the business into Ukraine. There are things that need to be fixed, whether it's Ukraine Invest, whether it's going to be sort of a different agency that's going to be coordinating just the basics of, how do properties rights work, what do I need to set up a company, and so on. There are things that are still happening to actually improve that. Second piece is financing, right? And I think on financing right now, the landscape is challenging, but there are a number of development banks that actually have a number of significant programs. There will be another portion of the EU Ukraine investment framework that will be released in the coming weeks, months. And there are a number of sources, right? You have to know how to navigate, but there are a number of sources, and and again, depending on the sector and the area that you're in, there's a lot of availability. Last week, the Ministry of Economy of Ukraine put out a handbook for Ukrainian businesses primarily, but basically that outlined all the different financing programs with EU guarantees that are available through Ukrainian banks, but also to give that access directly, whether it's EBRD, EIB, IFC, DFC, to be able for companies to actually be going and applying directly to the to these banks. And of course, the same thing exists for all the US companies and even more so. Export credit agencies. We are working on it because at the moment, sort of what they have available for Ukrainian businesses is expensive, and it's a bit challenging for sort of getting that last 10-20% guarantee, but we're working on products to be able to alleviate that and to change that. So again, if you are a US business that is producing goods, right, not necessarily going in and doing an investment, but producing goods that would be helpful for some Ukrainian importers, there are guarantees, there are financing options that are available for that as well, and we're working quite a bit to unlock that and make it more viable even further so. Look, on insurance, things are changing as well, right? I think one of the things, again, that surprised me by digging into it quite a bit, especially after DFC did a very useful facility, the sophistication of the Ukrainian insurance market is incredible, right? There are a number of companies that actually have some foreign ownership from Fairfax, from EBRD, but we all know very well there's a lot of data that's available about all the shellings, all the missiles, and sort of where they landed. The analysis that these Ukrainian insurance companies have done on this data is pretty remarkable. And they are actually writing war risk insurance, just in very, very small pieces. So if we can get more development banks to unlock more similar products like DFC did, providing reinsurance to a local Ukrainian company, there's models, there's willingness, there's skill, and there's ability to be able to do it. And we do hope that we can increase that over time. And we also hope that we can bring private insurance companies back into the Ukrainian market, maybe with some first loss provisions from development banks, but to be able to sort of create a stack and to be able to be providing insurance as well. Mm-hmm. So a lot of these things are there. Everything is work in progress, and that's okay. And I think it's also, again, the reality is, especially from development finance part, things take time, right? And so, again, when you're thinking, when you're planning, of course you're planning for a longer term, and you're planning to actually, the process of getting there, of getting the result that, that you're looking for is going to take a while longer, but it's about getting that process started, right? And the resources are tremendous. You know, we have, so again, Bank of America is basically doing a secondment with Ministry of Economy, but we're constantly exchanging with USAID. This business is interested in this, whether it's, you know, telco infrastructure, drone industry, insurance tech, you know, certain tech businesses. We're constantly exchanging views about where these businesses could actually get help from US government and from the likes of us to be able to do that first entry, to be able to have those first conversations. How do I go about it? You know, what legal firm do I hire to start setting up the business and things like that. So we are here. There are a lot of resources, and I think, again, there is a pathway that has been worked out. It just depends on what industry you're in and finding that most useful and sort of smoothest entry in.
A question from the audience for Greg. Many Western companies have restricted travel to Ukraine by their employees, and this creates understandable problems in maintenance and operations. How does Cargill manage that question of risk to personnel? If you could share some insights in how to think about that.
I'm retired, so I should be cautious in speaking for the current CEO. I can't tell you the specific policies that they have. I am on the board of John Deere, and in a lot of cases, we have tried to build technical skills in Ukrainian employees that can carry out work. Mm-hmm. And I think for people that have been in these places a long time, you talked about talent that you found. Cargill was a net exporter of engineers out of the Ukraine going back 15 or 20 years. Yeah. I can take you to plants in Canada that were built by Ukrainian engineers. As we built the plant in Donetsk, the one upside we saw was the amount of talent that was there that we could use and deploy around the world. But I can't answer the question specifically. My own bias would be that I'd be stunned if Cargill's one of the companies that's quit going.
Yeah. Well, and just also, I thought it was very helpful to highlight that there is plenty of local capacity to deal with these issues, right?
Yes.
So, turning to Maria, over recent months, Russia has stepped up its aggression on energy infrastructure. Devastating attacks show Russia is trying to undermine Ukraine's resolve through attacks on energy infrastructure. What is the U.S. doing to keep the lights on as winter is fast approaching?
Well, thank you. The energy sector has been a huge priority for the U.S. government since the war began. And just yesterday, Secretary Blinken with President Zelensky and the G7 had a meeting on this very topic. Because the Ukrainians' priority is to keep generation capacity through the winter. And it is a big challenge, especially since the attacks on the energy infrastructure really rose last spring. Before that, with the supplementals that I had talked about, we had committed over $1 billion to the energy sector. We were hoping that we would be able to do some of the long-term modernization, generation decentralization with those funds. But this spring, we did reallocate hundreds of millions of those funds to address the attacks and the most urgent needs of getting repairs and protection in place. With the last supplemental, we've just announced, Vice President Harris announced $500 million towards energy, the energy sector in June, and when Secretary Blinken was in Kyiv just a few weeks ago, he announced another $325 million. So we're pushing almost $2 billion. Other G7 partners and other donors have contributed $4 billion additional. We are really following the Ukrainians' lead on this. Their priorities are repair to existing infrastructure, protection of the infrastructure, having a reserve so they're ready for the next winter. Because as we've learned over the last few years, the lead time on a lot of this equipment that is being destroyed is very, very long. And so to do more planning for the next winter, as well as, I mean, we are hoping that, that we are going to be able to look to see if we can create any facilities to pull in the private sector to this sector. There are the innovations that the larger companies are doing to create their own energy generation. I think banks like the EBRD and others are also working on creative investments for the private sector, but those are just a few ways that we are working the energy sector with our assistance as well as diplomatically.
A question to the panel overall from the audience. What would EU accession mean for investment in Ukraine? Sofian, if I could turn to you first, then Aksa and anybody else who wants to jump in.
I think there's a lot of interest, intrigue, excitement for what that means for Ukraine, because fundamentally, if you look at the EU accession pillars, it is going to create the conditions that we have talked about in this panel and throughout this conference. And so I think, it works towards the modernization of the economy, creating new pathways for Ukraine to participate in the European economy and for companies to get access to that economy. I also think that some of the reforms that Ukrainians have been able to undertake during time of war it's pretty unprecedented. And I think that, some of the, when I was, when I was in Kyiv and talking to some of the leaders there, business leaders, Ukrainian business leaders, they said, I know that you have a lot of expectations of us. We have even higher expectations of ourselves, but we are still fighting a war. And I think sometimes in the discussions that we have here at home, we forget that. I also think that the amount of information that is available now, frankly, we do a lot of work with development agencies, multilaterals, bilaterals, and I have a lot of love and respect for the work that they're doing and how they're doing it. The hours, the travel, it's sort of a thankless job. Sometimes it feels like that. They're pushing out a lot of information. Industry also needs to match their resources, show up, engage, make some time and resources available. Not just ask for, if I'm interested in investing in Ukraine, I should also be doing some of my own analysis, some of my own business planning on what that could mean and bolster each other. One of the things we've been doing is called a shared experience session. And what we do is we connect our clients who are operating in Ukraine, let's say, and they want, and somebody in the same industry in America wants to spend or learn from their experience. So I think just by convening some of those discussions, it really accelerates that whole point forward, because the learning curve is pretty steep if you have not done business in that part of the world.
But I think the main thing is the reforms that would make everybody feel very confident about investing in Ukraine, right? I'm a Lithuanian national. We've been through the process. We know the enormous difference that it made. And look, and we all know that there's a lot in the Ukrainian sort of, structural setup from a regulatory perspective, how the energy sector is arranged, the procurement processes. A lot of it does need the tax system. A lot of it, do require revamp. And EU accession would basically mean that all of their laws, all of their regulations are basically put on the same platform as the rest of European Union is. And from a business perspective, that's exactly the confidence that you need to be going in. And again, I fully agree. I don't know the number, but I think the number is either 300 or 400 reforms that actually have been passed already, right? So again, when you think about what that parliament has to, the capacity that parliament has is just beyond belief. And this is all happening now, right? Now, again, the list is still quite long, but they are getting through it really fast. I think we also need to be acknowledging that the banking system in Ukraine is actually really solid and really well arranged. And if you think about sort of the sectors that need those reforms, a lot of that work is already in place. Energy probably needs a bit more. Agriculture, of course, is going to be more complex on EU integration. But it really would just give everybody's confidence to know that going into Ukraine, investing in Ukraine, under EU accession plan is basically going to give them the confidence and the access to a 40 million population market. So again, I keep on making the comparison to Poland, right? Everybody thought about how to enter the Polish market from consumer size perspective. It's the same thing, just with a whole lot more resources.
And Paula, you wanted to jump in?
Yes, I think you said it very, very well. I was going to mention reforms, but you well articulated that. But I'll add two other elements that are advantageous for Ukraine by becoming part of the EU. It's something that Ukraine is also very desirous of, which is greater integration into the West and in terms of its own position. And so my comment is more political in this case, and where Ukraine sees itself these days politically. And that's definitely for Lithuania and other countries. It's not just only the economic positioning, but you well articulated what would come with reforms. But separate from the political integration, the other third factor, we were talking about energy. And Maria, you were mentioning that whole dimension. By the way, this is one of the biggest issues for the EU at this time because of the weaponization of energy by Moscow. Right. And so in this context, there's also that great advantage for Ukraine in this space because Ukraine has a lot to offer in the energy space. And by the way, the other countries in the neighborhood are also extremely desirous. They've moved away from Nord Stream 2 and they're looking for other ways and means of bolstering energy supplies and resources. So that comes also part and parcel with that EU accession.
Well, we are running short on time, and this is, again, such a terrific discussion. One of the questions from the audience came up and that I'd like to pose to each of you, and so we can go down the line or jump in, whoever wants to take it first. As a policy or business leader, you're in an elevator with a congressman for a 2-minute ride. What do you say to her or him about why they should care about Ukraine from an American perspective?
I'll jump in. I'll start it since we're going down
Sure.
the line.
Yeah.
I would say that Ukraine winning and securing its independence and its own national sovereignty from this unprovoked war is in our interests, because if Ukraine is insecure, Europe is insecure, and the transatlantic community is insecure. And as Prime Minister Kishida, who came up here in Congress, he told you, all of you members, that what happens in Ukraine will also impact the Indo-Pacific, and the countries there are very concerned about China's aggression in Taiwan. This is not just an isolated Ukrainian issue, it's a global issue. It affects all of us, including the United States and our security.
Aksa?
I actually had that conversation yesterday, as it happens.
What did you say?
Well, we talked about long-range missiles quite a bit, and what that could mean. But I won't get into the defense conversation here. I think, look, the answer is long-term funding, right? As expensive and as as hard as it is for the U.S. Taxpayers to be consuming, but it is the long-term funding, right? We'll see what the outcomes are. We'll see what President Zelensky is going to present tomorrow on his plan to peace and to the end of the war. But the reality is it is going to require quite a bit of funding. So for me, it's again to say that you have to be ready for that funding to be there. And I have no doubt that whether you take a 10 or 20-year timescale, that funding is actually going to pay back.
Well, it gets back to one of the points made earlier. We have to be able to win the peace.
Yes.
CSIS said that in its report.
So, locally elected representatives respond to their constituents more than anybody else. And the direct linkage between our future or Ukraine's future and our future, somebody in our country, their employment, their well-being, their financial success, what's in it for them, I think that bridge, that connection has a lot of opportunity still in that narrative. And I think, so we also have had similar conversations in my personal capacity. And it is about linking the success of Ukraine to our constituents. And what does that mean? Does that mean more industry engagement, less unemployment? There are lots of things that we certainly, I don't see that in the narrative that we push out. And I think there's an opportunity there.
Right.
I'll stay in agriculture. The easy adage is no place on earth is as food secure as the earth. No place. And you can forget that, but in the time I served at Cargill, there were 3 years in which we imported soybeans into the United States. So we think we're above all of that interdependence, and we're not. At a political level, I'd say the world has an abundance of despots, and giving them implied license is bad for all of us.
Right.
And I think Paula stated it well, but I would say that what Russia is doing is a threat to our national security, our economic security, and our values. And so it's in our interest to fight that, and our objectives can be met by using the strongest diplomacy and using our fiscal resources, our human resources to help Ukraine fight that back and become the democracy and the European country that it wants to be. So that would be
If
my
Kathy would
pitch.
give me 30
Please.
seconds to go back into the elevator. I wanted to pick up on your point because I was looking at it from national security, but from the standpoint of the member of Congress. By the way, there was a piece, I hope everybody saw it, that well articulated how the funds that are going to Ukraine, 90%, I believe it was 90% benefits American workers and American manufacturing. The defense spending in the state of Ohio and many of these other places, and that's the member of Congress from that standpoint because of the constituents. But the fact is that the funding actually has benefited American workers and American manufacturing.
And I had the opportunity to take a delegation of LA-based screenwriters to NATO earlier this summer, and we had a lot of discussions about Ukraine, and the answer to them, what resonated with them was peace is a precondition to all of the things that you want to see. If you like the arts, if you like going to have a cup of coffee, if you like to do all the, peace is the precondition. Ukraine must win. So with that, I think it's lunchtime now. Thank you so much. If you give a round of applause to our incredible panelists.